So first of all, Mr. Speaker, how do you weigh the pros and cons of Speaker Pelosi's potential trip to Taiwan? Do you think she should go?
Well, I think now that it has become public, she has to go. And I think to back down before the Chinese communist dictatorship would send signals of weakness, would actually embolden Beijing to be more aggressive, and would make it look like America can be shoved around. You can have one conversation before this became public, although I am the highest ranking American ever to have gone to Taiwan. And I did so in a very direct disagreement with the Beijing government, which nonetheless invited me to come and give speeches in both Shanghai and Beijing with only the requirement that I had to go through Japan to get to Taiwan, that I couldn't fly direct. So I think this is at one level a lot of noise about nothing. I think if she holds her ground and if the Biden administration doesn't act timidly and almost cowardly, I think everything will be fine. She'll go. It'll be a nice event. Hope she takes a bipartisan delegation. And I saw a note this morning that she'd asked some Republicans to go with her. And I think that's a good signal of our support for Taiwan not being occupied or invaded by the People's Republic.
As you mentioned, that when the CCP threatened to withdraw your invitation in 1997, you insisted on going to Taiwan. But now China is a very different country now. Do you think your trip is still a good reference for Speaker Pelosi?
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, when we said that we were going to go to Taiwan, and they said you can't go to Taiwan, and Gardner Peckham, who was my national security advisor, said very clearly to them that the Chinese dictatorship does not instruct the American speaker on his travel schedule. And they came back and were tougher. We said, fine, if we have to choose between Beijing and Taipei, we're going to skip Beijing. So, if you're that mad, we won't come. At which point they promptly reversed themselves and said, no, we want you to come. And then they allowed me to give two very tough speeches about freedom and democracy and the rule of law, speeches which were pretty deviant from the way the dictatorship is run. The only concession they requested was that we couldn't fly direct from the People's Republic to Taiwan. China is in some ways different and not different. China has been a Leninist dictatorship since the Chinese Communist Party took over. Mao and the key leaders all were Leninists. They believe in a centralized hierarchical dictatorship with secret police and with basically as much thought control as they can get over every individual. It's a truly totalitarian system. It was back then, it is now.
But are you concerned about China taking some aggressive measures in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan? Because I'm sure you remembered the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996 is just 1 year before your visit to China and Taiwan. And back then, President Clinton responded by sending 2 aircraft carriers to the region. Are you concerned of China doing something now, and how should U.S. respond?
Well, I mean, the Chinese communists in 1996 were making threatening noises and were, I think, at the time, firing missiles and whatever. I was very publicly supportive of President Clinton sending the 2 aircraft carriers. I'm old enough. I remember the bombardment of Quemoy and Matsu in 1958. And I remember Eisenhower sending ships with nuclear weapons to stand off of China to say, we're not going to tolerate you invading these 2 islands. You have a totalitarian dictatorship with a very deep sense that it ought to be the central kingdom as it was before 1800. They're going to push as hard as they can on every front. And that's not illegitimate. I mean, it's their right to try to do that. Our job is to make sure that they confront countervailing strength so that they understand that there are limits to what they can get away with. And part of that's just purely psychological. And that's what we were doing in 1996 and 1997. And I was there to say, look, we really believe in freedom. We really believe in the rule of law. We are really prepared to on the one hand, Taiwan cannot declare its own independence. On the other hand, you cannot occupy Taiwan. And I was very clear in meetings with the most senior Chinese leadership. Admiral Jim Stavridis has pointed out that you could turn Taiwan into a porcupine. You could equip it with so many different defensive weapons that the cost of trying to take it would be so prohibitive that the Chinese just wouldn't try. Had we done that 2 years ago with Ukraine, there would never have been a Russian attack because it would have been too expensive. And I think that's the real lesson we should learn from the disaster in Ukraine.
Policy-wise, right? Do you think it's time now to update US policy towards Taiwan? Because for the past 40 years, strategic ambiguity has effectively avoided war and enabled the US to uphold relations with Taiwan while also develop ties with China. Do you think now is the time to update on that and take a more clear stance?
Well, I think we should. And it's very important to make clear that no military effort by the Chinese dictatorship will be tolerated, and that whatever it takes to defeat that military effort would happen. Remember, Taiwan produces something like 68% of the more advanced chips in the world. If Taiwan were for some reason knocked out economically, the impact worldwide, we think we have a supply chain problem now. You take Taiwan out of the chip manufacturing business, you have a worldwide crisis in virtually every modern system.
How do you evaluate on this one China policy? Do you think it served its purpose? And is it now the time for the US to recognize Taiwan's status?
Well, what I really think happened was tragic, is that when Hong Kong was given back to China by Britain, there was hope. And they talked about, two systems in one country. And there was a hope that if they could allow Hong Kong to remain truly free, that would then become a model by which you could then have Taiwan also become, three systems in one country. Problem is that the dictatorship cannot stand any zone of freedom. And so they have actually crushed the traditional openness of Hong Kong in ways that have both been economically very expensive and have shattered the traditional culture of Hong Kong. And so I think what you have now is a situation where why would anybody, the 24 million people living on Taiwan who are prosperous, who are remarkably free, who have real elections, who have a genuine open news media, who can travel all over the world, why would they want to have a Beijing-dominated secret police totalitarian state ruin their lives the way they've ruined Hong Kong? And that's the biggest difference. In '96, we had two hopes that turned out to be false. And Claire Christensen and I wrote a book called Trump versus China, where we went into this at some length, because I was one of the people who thought that the opening up of markets was the first step towards freedom. And I was just wrong. I actually, it's a bad sign probably about my education, but I actually did not realize that Deng Xiaoping was one of the first 23 founders of the Chinese Communist Party when he was actually in Paris during World War I. Went back to China through Moscow, spent a year at Lenin University, was a deeply committed Leninist. So when Deng Xiaoping makes the Great Southern Tour, which I've always thought was one of the most important events of the last 50 years, and gives these speeches that we have to be open to productivity, that I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, I care if it catches the rat, etc. Like most of our elites, I joined in thinking this is the beginning of opening up. Well, it was a profound misunderstanding. What he was actually saying was, we can only keep the dictatorship if we can provide enough prosperity that people don't throw us out. So it was a pro-dictatorship survival, not a modify the dictatorship, which is why Deng Xiaoping is one of the real hardliners at Tiananmen Square, demanding that they kill people. So that's the context. In '96, in '97, we were still in a place where we thought there was a genuine possibility that you would see the emergence of a moderate rule of law integrated in the world order Chinese system. I think now we all know that that's not not going to happen in the foreseeable future, that what you have is a totalitarian state. And remember, when Khrushchev makes his famous secret speech attacking Stalin, the reaction in Beijing is horrified because they see Khrushchev as the equivalent of Martin Luther launching the Protestant Reformation. They don't think this is a great idea. They love Stalin. They still love Stalin. Xi Jinping is much closer to Stalin and Lenin than he is to George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And so I think we have to take a position. I don't want us to deliberately provoke the Chinese communists, and I think to suggest that Taiwan be admitted to the UN, that the United States will establish a full embassy, et cetera. I think that would push us dangerously close to a genuine confrontation. On the other hand, I do not think an American speaker visiting the island will be anything more than an irritation.
Okay. Speaking of now, Xi Jinping is set to be re-elected for an unprecedented third term later this year. And as you know, that so-called reuniting Taiwan with China is one of his major political goals. And how do you think he will change the dynamics between US, China, and Taiwan?
Well, I think that he is probably very frustrated right now. COVID has been much more damaging to China than they want to admit. Their economy is really slowed down to a degree we haven't seen in 30 years. The unhappiness in the middle class and in rural China is much greater than it has been for a generation. And he's watching all of his neighbors gradually organize against him. I mean, the Chinese are a lot like the Chinese communists, are a lot like the Wilhelmine Germans in the late 19th century. They behave in ways that guarantee that everybody else gets irritated. And so I think what he's facing is that the great gamble that they could become the dominant country in the world is probably going to fail. And in fact, as you know, they're on the edge of a demographic cliff that is unbelievable. There may be as few as 400 million Chinese at the end of the century, because the impact of the one-child policy is so devastating that they're going to have a very, after 2050, they have a very limited workforce. They have a very, very big social burden of sort of retired people. As somebody once said, the Japanese were clever enough to get rich before they got old. The Chinese are about to get old before they got rich. And I think this means that Xi Jinping has a very short time horizon to have any hope of breaking free. And that as we just saw with a speech by the leading general in Taipei to a conference in Australia, you have this network building of virtually everybody who doesn't want China to dominate. And I think that's probably been a surprise to the Chinese how rapidly that's come together.
And what would your recommendation or advice be for the Biden administration to better deter China?
Rebuild the American military very dramatically. Make sure that you can dominate in space. Prepare to survive an electronic magnetic pulse attack, and prepare to dominate in cyber warfare. I mean, you first have to have the tools. It's not about dancing diplomatically. It's about having the sheer strength that by any reasonable standard, the Chinese dictatorship will decide that it is impossible to take us on.
What do you think the US could do more to better defend Taiwan's democracy?
Well, I would say two things. I'd say, first of all, we should ensure that they have all of the sophisticated defensive weapons they need on such a scale that it would be practically impossible for the Chinese communists to invade them. And that's not that hard to do. And Admiral Stavridis, the four-star admiral who was the head of NATO, has written extensively on this. And I think it basically talks about turning them into a porcupine so that they're just too hard to swallow. But the other thing we ought to do is we ought to remember, we need, just as we had with the Soviets, we need a radio-free China. We need a communication. We need to communicate that we are not opposed to the Chinese people. The Chinese people have every right to pursue happiness. They have every right to be productive. They have every right to live in prosperity and in safety. Our problems are with the totalitarian dictatorship. And I think we should have a much more robust outreach from programs like yours to make sure that we are communicating with the people of China, that there is a natural affinity between the American people and the Chinese people, and we should not let problems between our governments be confused into problems between our two peoples.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for taking my
Thank you.
interview.